Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Conversational Witchcraft with me, Dawn, the Kitchen Witch. If you haven't done so yet, make sure you like and subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, hit all the bells and the whistles so that when we have amazing guests on, like we have today, you get the info first. So today, really cool, we've got Ben Stimpson. Ben Stimpson is a therapist, a lecturer, a student, and a spiritual director. Ben has developed courses on a variety of topics, including ancestor, veneration, the power of story, and folklore. And when not working with clients or writing, Ben is engaged with his areas of study: religious studies, medieval and classical studies, folklore, and spirituality. Ben's own personal spiritual background includes Hinduism, NeoPaganism, Lukumi, which I'm sure I mispronounced,
Oh, you didn't?
Druidry. I didn't. I said it right.
No, you said it right.
Druidry and folk tradition. Ben, welcome to the show. I'm so glad I didn't
Hello.
butcher that.
No, you did perfect. That's perfect. Welcome. Thank you so much for having me on. I've been really, really looking forward to this interview.
Thanks. Thanks. I'm excited. I love meeting new friends. And before we hit all the recording buttons, we were already like getting on very well. And I was like, wait, we gotta hit the buttons. So we gotta make
Yes,
sure.
just fake his smile right now.
Yeah, fake this one. I'm not good at that. I have no poker face when I don't like someone. I'm like, yep. And so you can always tell that I'm
Okay, so I'm doing good. Okay, good.
totally spectacular. Thank you so much for being here. Now you are up in Canada, is that correct?
I am, yes. So when this eventually comes out, I'll still be in Canada. But later in the year, I'm actually going to be relocating to the UK. So I'm currently in Canada, but by hopefully next summer, 2024, I'll be in the UK.
And I was in Canada last week. So when we're reporting this in the summer, but I was in Montreal last week. It was my first time ever. And
Oh,
it was so amazing. It was so beautiful,
yeah.
not to diverge, but you're actually from the UK
I
and
am.
then you
I'm
moved to
originally from
Canada
the UK.
and now
Yeah.
you're going back.
And now I'm going back.
What's that
Yeah.
about? Are you just too
Well,
close to America? Because we kind of suck right now. Don't send me
no,
letters,
it's
people. Don't send me letters. We do kind of
no,
suck. It's okay.
it's been a oh well that's I mean Canada is starting to become like the states in that way, but it's not quite the states in that way. Certain parts of the states, you know. I'll be honest with you. I moved over here when I was 8 years old, and I
Yeah.
went back and I worked over there about 12 years ago, for an extended 6 month period, and I loved it, and it just felt like
Yeah.
home, and it ties in with the ancestor work that we'll talk about today, but it's actually becoming very expensive in Ontario. I live a few hours from Toronto, but it's becoming really expensive to live. Cost of living is just insane up here, so it just makes more sense. And I'm a citizen, so I can easily move over as opposed to going through a whole immigration process again. So
It's great.
lots of reasons. Yeah.
That's so great to have the dual citizenship and be able to bounce back and forth when you want to, But you grew up
Mhm.
in Canada.
I did. I grew up in Canada, so I've been heavily connecting with people of the community over there, trying to make friends, and like every so often having like good discussions around what it will be like. I have no doubt I'm going to have some culture shock, but having gone there about 10 years ago and worked over there for 6 months, I got a really good taste of what it was like at least 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's but I grew up with British culture in the home, so I now always feel like I'm in between somewhere. I don't have that transatlantic accent though, so
Right. So
I
you still
suppose if I
sound,
really wanted to.
yeah, you still sound like you're from the UK, but you were raised in
Yeah,
Canada mostly. But that had
yeah,
to be really hard. Is that what you said? You were 8 when you moved?
yeah.
And
Eight and
that's
a half
not
years old.
it's not like moving to another town or like even, when I was really little, when I was 5, there
Mm,
was the girl who was my best friend, and she moved from Virginia to New York, which is where I grew up.
right.
And then when we were 10, she moved from New York to New Hampshire, which is where I live now. But that's not, and that was hard enough. I mean, we were little kids. She was little, and she moved from New York to New Hampshire. It's the same. That had to be really, really difficult as a child.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I didn't realize it until a few years ago how much it fucked me up, and I'm very
Wow.
open about that. I talk about that in the book.
Yeah.
But what I dealt with was culture shock. I was old enough to still remember back home, and when I came over here, I was suddenly imagine this. I grew up in the UK. I was surrounded by all the people who sounded like me, acted like me. And although I had a learning disability and I needed to do speech therapy and I sounded a little bit different because I had a lisp back then, it was totally normalized. People just, I was at home. And then I suddenly come over here and I'm different, right? And that being different just compounded because, I came over here, I sounded different. I was a foreign kid. I didn't eat the same food at home and I was
Right.
weird. And then I discovered I was gay. Then I discovered I'm like interested in witchcraft, and then it just got weirder and weirder and weirder. So, um, it was one of
Yeah.
those. But it was culture shock, and it caused a great deal of issues in my life. And I only really resolved that in therapy a few years ago, and understood and put that all into context. And
Wow.
yeah, it was difficult.
Wow. Was that part of why you decided? Because in your professional life, you're also a therapist, a counselor, like,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
you're there helping people kind of deal with those same sort of things. Was that something, were those early experiences what drove you into that line of profession?
Think so. I think so. Originally, I was training to be a social worker,
Mm,
and I moved to Toronto from growing up. And I mean, it wasn't what made it even worse was I moved from a tiny little village in the UK where I'd grown up with everybody and everybody was familiar
yeah.
to a tiny little village over here in Canada where nobody was familiar. Everyone was related except me. I didn't have any family, all of that, right? I know, right?
Wow.
I originally I moved to Toronto and I chose to study social work, and social work just burnt me out because I couldn't help in the way that I felt like I wanted to, and of course, being part of a queer community too, there's a big drive, and when you have that experience of wanting to help others because you yourself were rejected and all of these things, right? So I think so. Eventually, what led me to therapy work and psychotherapy work was spirituality. Actually, the training
Mm,
program I did with the psychotherapy program I did in Toronto was spiritual psychotherapy, and so it really brought in all of these pieces that I had been working in my private life into a professional career, and so that's where the power of story comes in. That's where ancestral work comes in. I often like to say my book is just 250 pages of a therapy session between you and your
I
ancestors,
love it
but it
so
is
much.
true. Yeah.
I love it. And I like that.
So
I'm very fascinated by the links between, um, therapy, neuroscience, witchcraft, magical working, energy working, because the connective tissue between these things, once
totally.
you know it's there, it's impossible
Absolutely.
not to see, and
Hmm.
not to connect those dots. So I love talking to people that are pagans and witches that really get the therapy aspect of things, that really understand mental health is a real thing, you
Yes.
know. So you're a kid and you're growing up in Canada and you're missing your home, and you're obviously dealing with all those little kid things that we don't realize until we get older, and they're like, oh wow, I was really fucked up by that. Like that friend I told you about that moved when we were little, like I stopped talking. I was 10 years old. I stopped talking. I didn't want to do anything. I
Yes.
didn't want to go. I was really, really
Yeah.
traumatized. And as a little kid, starting to go to see a therapist didn't work out so good at that
Yeah.
time. But it was one of those things where you realize after the fact, you're like, oh, I can literally pinpoint these
Yes.
moments that really fucked
Yeah.
me up as a kid,
Yeah.
right?
In
So,
retrospect, right? Yeah.
right.
Hindsight is 2020. Yeah.
So, at what point during this journey did you find witchcraft and energy work?
Well, it's interesting because so I'm 36 years old. That's very important for this conversation. I'm 36 years old, and so I was just turning into like a teenager around the year 2000. So 2000, I'd been in Canada for 5 years. I was just coming to terms with my sexuality.
Mm,
9/11 happened in 2001, right? Again, very important for this conversation.
yeah.
So there was suddenly a space in the culture where not only was I feeling ungrounded and unsure of where I was, suddenly the rest of the culture was. And anyone who grew up or was who was able to understand what was happening in 2001 can understand that suddenly the Western world didn't feel as secure. And although I didn't understand that back then, I was like, there was something about what was happening around me in the culture that really then like it gave me shocks. So I started to look for roots. And one of the big things with kind of moving from any country is that, you know, all of those cultural pieces that we don't think we would miss or that we aren't even aware of, suddenly you really miss because, you know, it's not there anymore. So I started latching on to anything I could that was British. So I started watching like Absolutely Fabulous when I was like in the UK. And I remember like watching Patsy and Adina do their thing. And as a young pre-understanding he was a gay kid, that was like, you know, drag queen and what, right? It was
Right.
amazing. But
Right.
like, you know, all the old comedies, my parents still watch British television.
Yeah.
Ontario still had a lot of British television on the public television, like they did with PBS, right?
Yeah.
So I still had content, but it wasn't enough. And I remember always being captivated. Where I'm from in the UK is North Wales, and that's quite close to where Mara Starling and Christopher Hughes and like a lot of the British writers are right now. And that is such a magical landscape. It's like any kind of old European place. It has that folklore that's still there, and the stories of the fairies and whatnot. And I
Yes.
remember we had a load of books on folklore in the house, so I became really interested in fairies and fantasy. I think also partly as an escape,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah, for
remember
sure.
growing up on Dragonlance and fantasy books and Lord of the Rings and all that,
Yes.
being captivated, right? I think this is a
Yes.
common thing for any of the witch folk, right?
Agreed.
So
Agreed.
from there, I then discovered the Mists of Avalon. And the Mists of
Mm.
Avalon, originally I didn't read the book, but I watched the TV show, the little movie that they put
Yeah, it
together,
was like I remember exactly what you're talking about. It was like a mini series. It was like a
a little
three-part
mini
mini
series.
series or
Yeah,
something, and it was fantastic.
I loved it.
It
I
was
loved it.
so
It was
good.
amazing.
Yes,
And
agreed.
so like 2001 that came out in 2001, like all of these things converged, and I was at the point where I was starting to understand that I didn't feel comfortable, or I was being rejected by the Christianity in my small town. My
Mm.
small town, there was 8,000 people, 18 different churches, 18 different denominations, and none of them seemed to want me. So I was this little kid, like convergence of all things. We also got the internet around that time, which was huge. So suddenly I got online.
Wow.
I was watching the Mists of Avalon. I was like, "Oh, goddess worship! What is this?" I was able to get
Google.
a
This is
copy of
before Google,
Google
right? This is
exactly.
before
Oh,
Google.
Alta Vista,
Yes.
Dogpile,
Yes.
Ask Jeeves,
Yes.
right?
Ask
And I got on
Jeeves. Ask
Ask Jeeves,
Jeeves.
yes,
Yes. Yeah. Goddess
you know,
of Avalon. Clickety click click.
goddess of Avalon.
Yes. And then
Yeah.
dial up.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and so then I came across Wicca, like it was internet popular
Yeah.
90s Wicca, but I got onto Witchfox, I got onto all of these, like I know Witchfox, right? Blast from the past. See, 36 becomes very important in this conversation.
Yes.
But so from
Wow.
there, then I started to explore this idea of spirituality and witchcraft as something that I could take on. I also watched The Craft. I watched, all these like classic things, right?
I love
And then that
I'm a
led me.
little older, quite older than you. And I love that you referred to The Craft as classic. Because that's look, that was we all wanted to be those girls. And I remember being like 18 years old and finding my path. And my
Oh
very
yes.
first book was To Ride a Silver Broomstick. And it's very, very common, right? And I remember having conversations and telling people, "Oh, I'm a witch, or I'm a pagan," and they'd be like, "I'm a witch too. I watched The Craft like 17 times, and I do candle magic." And I'm like,
Love it.
mm,
I
mm,
love it. I love
not,
it. I
not,
love it.
not really. But it's interesting, right? Because you made a point of saying, like, getting so into these fantasy stories and magic in stories and media, and yes, as a way of an escapism. But there's all kinds of things that are escapist, right? Action
Absolutely.
movies, sports, these are escapes, these are entertainments. But witches tend to
It
we
was a
tend
little
to
bit more than that. You're right.
gravitate towards, and then we go,
Yes.
hmm, I wonder. Okay, so you're a young man, you're 18, 19 years old. You're just discovering
Oh,
witchcraft.
even earlier than
Even
that, 13,
even
14.
wow.
Yeah. I turned 12 in 2000. So I was 13,
So
14,
you were
around the
like,
time I was starting to, yeah, really young. Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Really
Sorry,
young.
I didn't do the math there. I know you've said
No, it's okay.
36 a
No, no,
bunch
no,
of
no.
times.
It's okay.
How did were your
Yeah.
parents very traditional and not, I mean, you're here in this really Christian community
Mm,
in Canada,
yeah.
right? But my impression, and I could be wrong, so
Mm.
please stop me if I am, is that the UK is a lot more, like you said, it's steeped in these traditions, right? So
It's
when you say
steeped,
something
yes.
like, if you're like, oh, I was out in the field and I was playing with the fairies, even if you're a
Mhm.
40-year-old woman, people will be like, yeah, I get that,
Yeah, yeah,
They're like,
yeah.
yeah. If they saw you walking down the street with a bowl of milk and honey, and
Mm,
and you said, "Oh, it's my offering for the fairies," they'd be like, "Yeah, okay, go on." You know,
yeah.
in America, that's not the case. People look at you like you're
Hmm.
nuts. I
Yeah.
don't know if that's the case in Canada, but were your parents like on board with like, oh, our kid is really into this stuff and it's nothing, he's just crazy, or yeah, we get it.
Well, so British culture is is very strange when it comes to religion, because I'd say, like, I mean, we had a civil war around religion,
Yeah,
right? In a
yeah,
way that was a lot, like, it really set the stage for a secularism.
yeah.
So the UK is very ambivalent when it comes to, I would say generally, very ambivalent when it comes to religion, when it comes to kind of outward showing of religion, because, we culturally we've had such a dangerous dynamic between Protestants and Catholics,
Yeah.
that I think religion in general is very much a, we don't talk about that, do that in your home. Or the parts of the religion, Anglicanism, Church of England particularly, that is very kind of foundational and societal and out there, institutional is the word I should say,
Mm-hmm.
is just seen as a part of the culture. Like, my parents are those kind of Anglicans, and my mum was never baptized, I was never baptized,
Mm-hmm.
but they're the type of people who would have only gone to church for, christenings or weddings or funerals.
Right, right,
And even then, funerals were like that, right? Depending on if they liked the person or not, right?
right.
So they didn't. I don't. And even now, I don't think my parents understand religion. They don't understand
Yeah.
why somebody would be so interested in that, because
Mm-hmm.
they're working class. Their focus is more on kind of surviving and,
Yeah.
perpetuating that sort of thing. That being said, I think in the Catholic community in England and the UK, I think there's a lot more religiosity, but that's because of identity. Being a Catholic is not a religious thing; it's a religious identity. It's a
Mm.
community. It's so much more than Anglicanism is, because Anglicanism is just like, the connection between being English and being Anglican has been set in stone for 300 years now. That
Right.
there's no blur. There's a lot of blurring between those things, right?
Right.
So they didn't quite understand why I was interested. I think they still don't understand why I'm interested in spirituality.
Yeah.
Um, but that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
I think there's a swinging the other side. I think there's a lot more people who are interested in alternative forms of spirituality, and even like in folk religion and folk Catholicism. There's a lot of interest. I'm noticing, anyways, in the witchcraft community, to reclaiming Christian, working with saints and the
Yes.
folk elements of Christianity as a part of a kind of an identity, a social identity. There's a lot
I
of
would have
things
to
around
agree.
that.
I would have to
Yeah.
agree with that for sure. And I think that you hit a couple of really important points there. The first being the difference between religion and spirituality, right? Because yes, I would say I'm a witch or I'm a pagan in terms of my religion, but I don't think about it as religion. I think about it as, because to me, religion is organized, right?
Yes.
It
Mm-hmm.
you have somebody telling you the rules, and you have to follow this doctrine, and stand up, sit down, eat the cookie, drink the wine.
Right.
That's the world. That's the world I grew up in. So for me, that's religion. Being a pagan, being a witch is more of a spiritual practice. For me, I don't want to say that that is correct for everyone, but that is for me. And I definitely think that there is the very tip of the iceberg of, like you said, reclaiming some of those folk traditions, because there is folk tradition, folk magic, as we would call
Yes.
it, little
Yes.
things like um you know
Malokia. Let's talk about Malokia.
things like that, right? Like we would do these. I mean, as an Italian person who grew up in New York with a little old Italian grandmother, she would sit in the dark with her rosary beads.
Right.
You know what I mean? And she would
Yeah.
she would have to do the cycle. And I don't
Mm,
I don't think that that's coming down from the religious organization. I think that tradition of, this is my daily affirmation, this is my daily prayer,
very
this
much
is my
so.
daily
Yeah.
ritual, you know, um, little things like, spitting on people for good luck. That's,
Right.
that's folk tradition that you are seeing those things now getting passed around, or being like, oh, hey, yeah, no, my little old great grandmother used to do this thing.
Yes.
And, whether it was Catholic or whatever, um, there is a resurgence of that for sure. Um,
Totally.
I hope. I hope that's happening a lot here.
I think so. I think so. I was having this conversation with, well, on another podcast and also with a few friends of mine. We were talking about kind of what we notice when there's social instability. What we tend to notice is people tend to gravitate towards what is going to ground us, right? During the pandemic, the reason that people went out and like mass bought silly things like $700 worth of toilet paper is because seeing that thing helped to ground them, right? It came from a fear place. I think that a lot of these older traditions, and I noticed this when people are a lot of traditional witchcraft folk or folkloric witches, when you really ask them, they tend to have had a history of being interested in African traditional religions
Mm.
or other forms of extant traditions that seem to have a very solid foundational piece. And what often happens is then people will look at their own cultural traditions or their own background traditions and tease out those traditions or resurface them in order to form groundings. So I think that over the past 10 years, at least that's what I've been seeing, is that we have social instability. We have a large generation of people who are not sure about the future. And so what are
Yeah.
we looking? We're looking at the past, right? We're reclaiming that past for ourselves. Myself, like I'm not a Christian, but I have to be honest, I really love Catholicism and Anglicanism. And I have that in my ancestral tradition. That's part of
Yeah.
my ancestral tradition, And so
Yeah.
to plug into that isn't necessarily because I'm, wanting to, suddenly become a Jesus freak.
Right.
But it's because that has been a container for the culture that has now led to my experience. So I think that in many ways, we're looking more at the container to tease out and find our story in that than necessarily the evangelical, like, on my knees, because I only
Yeah.
go on my knees for certain people, right?
I
So,
agree. I agree. There's, yeah, and
you
only
know,
on very special occasions. Um, I I want you to really, I want people listening to really think about what you said about when people are in uncertain times, that
yes,
we gravitate towards things that ground us. And as you're talking about that, all I was thinking was, as a kitchen witch, right? All I was thinking about was through the pandemic, how the big thing was bread making,
yes, yes.
right?
I
Like,
love that.
right. Everybody is making bread.
Right?
Everybody's learning how to do sourdough starters. Everybody's
Yes,
baking. And then it was, okay, well, what else? What was the huge trend that people were watching was British baking show, right?
yes,
Bake Off. Everybody was watching Bake Off, bringing us to these traditions that are around home, family, nurturing. That is folk magic, right?
very
How
much so.
to, and now there's if you're anywhere online and you're looking at any of these things, you're seeing very young people getting into homesteading, getting into canning,
Yes.
growing their own food, really connecting with the land, really connecting with Mother Earth, the cycles, nature, the seasons, right? These
Yeah.
are folk practices and magical practices and energetic practices that ground us in the here and now, and
Yes.
also psychologically allow us to feel a sense of control of our own space and of our own life.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah.
Right.
That sense of control. Yeah.
Right. So we do these things as spiritual beings, but also as and energetic beings, but also as human beings with mental health and needs, emotional
Yeah.
needs. And when we can marry the two, we're kind of creating balance in our mental health and our
Yes.
spiritual health. And I think you hit on that so beautifully in explaining why people go to these practices that ground them. And that's why we're seeing this resurgence, over the last decade, as you said. I mean, even since 9/11, upheaval in our world has just, I mean, it's growing and growing and growing. It's constantly multiplying. And the pandemic, and like you were talking about, how
All of these pieces.
all of
Yeah.
these pieces, what can we do as individuals is to come back to ourselves, come back to our heritages,
Yes.
come back to these practices that allow us to find peace and control in our own lives, right? And how do we do that? We work with lineage in the past. We work with ancestors. We tap into our roots, which are deep and wide, right?
Very much so.
Ancestral
Very much so.
magic. Ancestral
Very much
magic.
so.
So,
But I would also take that a step further, because we aren't just tapping into these traditions and taking them just by rote. We're making them a part of ourselves. We are expanding them to include us, and we're finding ourselves in this. I was actually criticized recently because when somebody looked at my guest list for my own podcast, all they saw were either a lot of men and a lot of white people, and fair, that's a fair assessment. But they said, but you don't have a lot of women. And what the focus of my podcast is actually queer identity. And so the vast majority of my practitioners who will come on, and guests who come on, are all queer of various different identities. So it was interesting to see then how we even view the community that we're part of, the witchy community, through that lens of self. And it makes total sense. I sat back and I was thinking, okay, how am I going to respond to this? I decided not to respond to it just because you can't respond to everything. But I sat back and, okay, where is this coming from? Okay, this individual appears to connect with witchcraft through her femininity, through her female identity, through her experience as a woman, right?
wow.
Which makes total sense for her age range. She seemed a little bit older. So I was making assumptions here. They may have been completely wrong, but one of the reasons that witchcraft became so popular in the 1970s and 80s was the goddess women's movement, right? Totally makes sense. The vast majority of the queer practitioners, and there seems to be a connection between folkloric witches and queerness. And so a lot of the writers that I'm seeing are all tend to be on the queer spectrum somewhere, right? It's weird. It's something. I'm looking into it a little bit more. I want to understand
It's
that
definitely
myself.
something. I've had people criticize my podcast as well and say, how come all the men you have on are queer men? And I'm like, I don't know. They're good. I'm not trying to have, specifically queer men on, but if you want me to have a straight man on that talks about witchcraft, find me a straight man that talks about witchcraft. There's a couple, there's a handful,
there's a couple,
but I'm over here going, I don't care who you are. If you've got something interesting to talk about, let's talk about it. So I didn't even think, oh, should I be
well, that's the thing, right? Yeah. I sat back and looked at my own, and I was thinking about this. But I think there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
There's a recurring theme among all of the guests that I've had on. People like Matt Oren, Devin Hunter, Nicholas Pearson, Craig Spencer, all of the whole pantheon, right? All the people you've had on too. What are they saying? They all watched Buffy in the night. Like they're all of the same age range. They all watched Buffy and the Craft when they were younger. They
Yes.
all, gravitated towards the strong female writers like Silver
Yes.
Ravenwolf. And what did they not find? Queer identity in that. They didn't
Right.
see gay writers, so they've
Right.
become that, right?
Right.
So it's interesting. We take these traditions, but we expand them to include us. We find ourselves in it. And I think that's for multiple different personalities and different kind of backgrounds, right?
I love that
So
so
it's
much.
fascinating.
The
Yeah.
identity that we bring to our own witchcraft, and something you said
Yep.
at the very beginning about, the stories we tell
Yes.
because of the stories of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very difficult to see the world through any lens but your own, because you only have your own
You only
experiences.
have your own lens. Exactly.
Right, exactly. So this kind of brings us right into everything about your book, Ancestral Whispers. And so we're going to take a quick break, hear from our amazing sponsors, and then we come back. We're going to take a deep dive into your most recent work. Okay, we'll be right back with the amazing Ben Stimpson. Do you need a break, my friend?
Oh no, I'm good. I'm
Great.
good.
Okay, here we go. Welcome back to Conversational Witchcraft. It's me, Dawn the Kitchen Witch, chatting with Ben Stimpson today. Okay, so right before the break, we were talking about, seeing the world through our own lens, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell others in our own witchcraft and magical and energetic practices, which brings us to your new book, Ancestral Whispers. So it's awesome. And this book,
Thank you.
we're recording this before it
Comes
publishes,
out. Yes.
but it's going to be available when this airs. So it's very exciting. One of the things that's really cool about this book is that even though we're talking about witchy stuff and paganism and stuff like that, it's written in a tradition non-specific way.
Yes. Yes.
Right. So it doesn't
Yes.
matter what you practice or how you identify religiously or spiritually, you can get into this. Why was it important for you?
It was important for me because of the diversity of my spiritual background, right? I have been blessed with being able to be an insider or somewhat of an insider to many different traditions. And with Lukumi, for example, although I didn't initiate into Lukumi, Lukumi is Santeria for those who know it through that name. Foundationally, ancestral work is so important to that tradition. It is something that anybody who is starting to become involved in it is not only pressured to do, but it's foundational. You have to do it. The ancestors become the literally the ground that we walk the rest of our journey on. That's the imagery, and but a lot of the rituals are connected to the ancestors of that tribe. And initiation into any African tradition is literally seen as initiation into the tribe. You take on the ancestors of that community, as well as your own ancestors. And so I as somebody who has a British background, who's really connected with British heritage and my ancestors over there, because I didn't have connection to them physically, or I only could meet them through story because being over here, I started to think, okay, well, what can I do for my ancestors, right? How am I going to bring this in? And I feel like, at least when I started writing this, I noticed that a lot of people talking about ancestral veneration, they'd watched the movie Coco, they had been gravitating towards writers who were talking about
Right.
ancestor work from a BIPOC perspective. They didn't know how to work with their own ancestors without appropriating. And so what was important for me with this book was to give a roadmap, like a therapy session. This is a therapy session. It's a couples counseling between you and your ancestors. And it's asking the important questions. It's asking the important questions that then anybody can develop a relationship in an authentic, non-appropriative way. And I go into why that's important to not
So
appropriate.
important. Yeah.
It really is
So
important.
important.
Now, that being said, I think that there's also, there's a, and don't come at me, don't send me emails, but I've
It's
noticed
just a conversation,
that it's
people.
just a conversation.
Right.
But I have noticed that a lot of particularly white or Caucasian background individuals in North America and other settled countries They tend to see ancestor work as only a BIPOC thing. And so then they only go to see BIPOC, they only gravitate towards BIPOC spaces to see what they can take with them. And so I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think there's a lot of reasons connected to like the funeral industry that has really disconnected Westerners from the idea of death and from the idea of connecting with the ancestors. I think that it also comes to religious trauma, particularly with ancestors who are Christian, right? You suddenly have this
Wow.
situation where you have witches and neo-pagans and people who have come from Christianity with religious trauma. Suddenly there's this disconnect. Well, how am I going to work with all these Christian ancestors if I'm not Christian anymore? And I don't believe in that, but they did. How am I going to work with that? So what often happens is we then look at, oh, my pagan ancestors. Oh, my ancestors were pagans. My ancestors were unbroken line of witches going back, blah, 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 however long it goes. It goes back to that idea of story and narrative. But that story and narrative comes back to then emphasizing our own personal identities, right?
Wow.
So do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
having me said that, have you seen that as well?
I definitely, as a Caucasian woman in her 40s, definitely feel often like, oh, that practice isn't for me, or this practice isn't for me. And definitely, you struck a chord with me when you said there's a disconnect with working with the ancestors when you identify as pagan or a witch, but your ancestors are all Catholic. Like, there's
Yeah,
still shame for me going, oh, maybe my grandma
totally.
she wouldn't want me to be doing this. So
Right.
maybe I shouldn't do it, But
Mm,
I do think there are things that we do that are ancestral magic
yes.
that we don't realize that they are.
Mm,
And for me, in my practice with, primarily kitchen witchcraft, it's
mhm.
very alive all the time.
Of course. Of
Right.
course.
So, I mean,
Hmm.
in the magical tools that I use in terms of,
Yeah,
things that I have that are actually passed down, that are,
absolutely.
pots and pans and spoons and things like that.
Yes.
And then I can stay connected, but there are things that I don't do
Right.
that I'm not connected with. And at the very
Mm,
beginning, before we even hit record, I had said to you, I'm really interested in your work because ancestral magic is something that outside of the kitchen, I have a really hard time with. I was estranged from my father's family. I know very, very
right.
little about their background.
Right.
And I don't know much about on my mother's side and my maternal side. I know a little tiny bit, but my grandmother never talked about Italy. She never talked about it.
Right.
So I don't know what
Right.
happened, you
Yeah.
know. I know very little. So my relationship with them isn't fabulous. And the work I do doesn't leave my kitchen, right?
Right.
So
Right.
it's really interesting to me to hear you talk about this in a non-tradition specific way, right? Because I would love to learn other ways to connect that aren't going to offend my ancestors,
Right.
right? What about that? Like, are people concerned about offending their ancestors?
I would say so. I would say so. I think that there's definitely that perception of offending ancestors. You said something very, very critical just then. You said, I want to learn ways to connect. I'm going to challenge that and say that you actually already know ways to connect. It's the do I have permission to do it?
Right.
Does that make sense?
I mean, yeah, it does.
Yeah,
Um,
right?
yeah, and the searching. I think there's a searching
Yes.
element as well. I had um I had another person on maybe last year who wrote an ancestral book, and she does some healing through ancestral work. And I had this similar conversation, and I said, "Yeah, I don't really know who they were." And she goes, "Oh, they know you." And
So yeah, it's
I was
true.
like, "Fuck,
Yeah, I know.
fuck, fuck."
Right?
Do they? And she's like, "Oh yeah,
Yeah.
they know
Yeah.
who you are." And I was like, "Oh, mother, all right, crap." Like, what does a lot of that come through for you? Like, now that you're So let's get back to you, because we're not going to talk about my ancestors. It's
Of
too
course, of
much.
course, of
It's
course. Sorry,
too much.
it's turning into a therapy session here.
I
Sorry.
know, exactly. And I will ride that
Yeah.
train. So where did you find that connection back
Well,
to your ancestors?
Well, so my connection with my ancestors has always been a true story. They've like, because when I left, like when my grandmother, who I was closest to, passed away, I wasn't allowed to at her funeral because I was 5 years old. My parents, particularly my dad, said no because he had to go through a funeral when he was a child, and it was
Oh,
traumatic for him. So
yeah.
death, I've never actually been at a family funeral at all. And when I moved over here, we never went over and visited. There was issues. There were big issues with that.
Yes.
But
Yes.
so for me, my ancestors have always been up here, and through the stories that my mum has been telling me and my dad has been telling me, and through pictures, right, and the memories that I have. I feel lucky that I have memories of some of those individuals. My
Yeah.
younger brother doesn't. He was too
Yeah.
young. So that connection was always there. Like I have vivid memories of staying with my one grandmother. I think the key piece for me was when I actually had to do, as part of my psychotherapy program, I had to actually go and do a family research project, which was huge. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful thing to do, and what really clinched it for me was it wasn't just a family research project. It was something called a genogram, which is a very particular form. It's a tool that's used by social workers and doctors. What it does is it doesn't just look at family, like who they were and where they were born, when they were married. What it does is it tracks family patterns, it tracks relationships, it tracks any kind of medical information that you can find out. It
Wow.
tracks issues like alcoholism, workaholism, and whatnot. So those are the lenses that I was bringing to researching my family. And I had to go back 5 generations. And what was fascinating was when you start to think about your family in that way, you start with yourself and move backwards to find the sources of things that you grew up with. So in my family, there was alcoholism, there was workaholism, because my parents were both self-employed. That's a very important part of our family story. They both came over here, they started a business, and they were very stressed out because of that, and it created issues. When I actually started to know to ask the right questions, suddenly I was able to start to make deductions of, okay, so on both sides of my family, workaholism is a big thing. Both my grandparents, both my grandfathers were plumbers. Both of their fathers were plumbers. Both of their grandfathers were self-made individuals, and so on and so on. And when I actually looked at the history then, I got onto ancestry.com. I figured out that both sides of the family, both great-great-great-grandfathers, were in the workhouse. And the workhouse was this horrific debtor's prison, basically, back in the 1800s, right? So it made sense. Okay, so we have this situation of a trauma 6 generations back, where suddenly class was just compounding onto these individuals, making them feel morally corrupt and inept because they were poor, right? So what's the alternatives of that? Okay, well, you become self-made people. You gain that power through building yourself up. Both of them then apprenticed, or their children apprenticed, and then they took on a trade in this and so.
Wow.
So suddenly I have this story of my family on both sides. It makes total sense that my parents would gravitate towards each other and then lead to me.
Wow.
Right? I know.
Holy shit.
It was as a form of therapy for myself, because this is now a tool that I use for my own clients.
Yeah.
It was powerful, but then I also had the spiritual element in there.
Yes.
I was living while I was doing my psychotherapy program. I was living with my godfather at the time, who was a crowned priest of Oshun, and they have divination techniques that they can contact the dead directly. I was also involved with a couple of other people. I sat a dumb supper, and was able to speak to my grandfather to verify some of these details. So I had the spiritual side and I had the kind of the physical evidence side, and they spookily married together. So that helped me to develop then a relationship with these people, and also understand that they are present in the world around me now. That's the other thing I really want to stress with this is that we often think of ancestors as dwelling in the past. No, they lived in the past. They
Right.
dwell here and now, right? And if they
Right.
dwell here now, just like, versions of us existed in the past as well, but we're different from them. Just like when the dead, when they were living, were in the past, there is, at least this is my own perspective, they have that capacity to grow and be in the present now with us. So I was able to work some stuff out with my grandfather, who there
Wow.
was some stuff. It was amazing. It was amazing. So it was
Wow.
really important as I was writing that then this came into this work, because that was my journey. That was my journey with my ancestors. I was able to develop my practice to reflect my relationship with them and build on that relationship. That's really what my ancestral practice is all about. Right?
Continuing to build on a relationship with those ancestors.
That's
and
exactly it.
how that informs, as you said before, your identity and how you tell the story to yourself and how the story reflects back at who you are.
Exactly.
That's incredible. I'm sure people ask you tons of questions about this type of work. Is there something we should be talking about that we're not?
I would say yes. So the biggest piece is that ancestor work, like, I feel like a lot of people think in witchcraft that ancestor work is magic, that ancestral magic is the most important bit. And I think that there's good reasons why that is. And I know you've brought that up today. You've been referencing that today. But what if it's just ancestral relationship in the same way that deity work is deity relationship or spirit relationship? Then the magic is really just what you do, right? It
It's
isn't a
the
focus,
result.
it's just part of it. Exactly.
Right.
Right. I'll give you a very good example, right? So I know it's a common meme going around that, Italian housewives, they just pour until their nona spirit tells them to stop, right?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Right. You
What?
have to have that relationship with your nona beforehand in order to feel that, like, no, stop, child, stop, right? The relationship is there
That just made me
beforehand.
feel like you said that. And I
Oh,
just was like, oh, okay, sorry.
right.
You
No,
have
no,
to
no, no,
have
no.
that
It's okay.
relationship, right? That you stop, child, stop. And I literally just felt like,
Yeah.
yeah. Ooh. Sorry, Ben.
Ah.
Sorry.
No, no, no,
Because
no, no, no. That's the thing. That's the thing, right? But
amazing.
you already have that relationship with your nona, and even if you don't necessarily know who they are, I think that guest before is very important. They said they know you because, and I'll expand on that.
Yes.
We can only know the people whose names are written down and whose stories are still being told. But what about all of those ancestors that existed before that? Right? Now, not knowing who they were doesn't mean that you can't know anything about them, because the context that we live in now was created by all of those ancestors, right?
Can
And
you
when you look at
expand upon that?
genealogy,
That's
of
amazing.
course. Well, so the world that we live in, the world that we live in today, was created 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and so forth, right? We create the context of our tomorrow, just in the same way that our ancestors created the context for us to come in, right? Some things we're living with socially, the origins of them are actually thousands of years ago. Some of
True.
them are just a year ago, right? So
True.
we're still living with that context. There's also that other piece of, the vast majority of people in our ancestral lines are not going to be known to us. But when you look at the way that genealogy works, eventually you get to a point after so many generations that so many of your ancestors, if you're from a particular place, existed in that place, that the history then of that community was the history of enough of them that it was your family history. So if you think two
Wow.
grandfathers, two grandparents, two parents, four grandparents, eight great grandparents and so on and so on. By the time you get to 10 generations back, you're looking at millions of ancestors. Now,
Right.
eventually what happens is there's something called genealogical breakdown, because you get to a ridiculous amount of people that can't possibly have all existed at the same time, right? So you get individuals then appearing multiple times in your ancestral tree, especially when you know that you're from your background is from a particular area. And so eventually your story, your family story, becomes the story of that whole village, that whole region, that whole country,
Wow.
the further back you go. So you may not know
Wow.
your own family line, but you know, like if we go back 500 years, there are enough of my personal ancestors existing in the Kingdom of England that I know that anything going on in the Kingdom of England 500 years ago affected enough of my ancestors that that whole history is also my history, right?
Wow. I think too, when people think about ancestors, they tend to think grandparents, great grandparents, and they think about that, but they don't think about your grandparents had siblings, and those people had
Totally.
children, and those people had children, and you have like great great grand cousins and great great
Yeah,
grand
exactly.
uncles. There's all
Yeah.
those people,
It
and
becomes a web.
it's a web.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And
Mm-hmm.
and one thing that we keep kind of skirting around is
Mm-hmm.
that we are creating our world, right? The
Absolutely.
ancestors created this world that we
Mm-hmm.
are, we're effectively living in a world that was created by those who've gone before us, whether their
Yes.
genealogy matches ours,
Right.
or we're yeah, what's the word I'm looking for, genetically connected
Yes.
or not. The today is based on what happened yesterday and before and before.
Exactly.
So then how do we create and continue to create worlds, stories, and legacy, and become ancestor? How do we live better and practice spiritually better or different now to
Yeah.
create and become those who will be once in the past? Because we will then become
Yes.
them. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Of course, definitely. That I think that is a lot more of an uncomfortable. It's not a complicated answer, it's an uncomfortable answer, which is that we need to learn as much about the context that originated our world now in order for us to make better decisions about the future that we're creating. And unfortunately, that means that we will come up with uncomfortable history. If family systems theory, from a psychotherapeutic point of view, has created anything for me, it is this. Families are very, very good at ignoring all of the negative things. You gave a
Yes.
very good example earlier. You don't know what happened in Italy when your nonna came over. No idea.
No idea.
Right? A lot of people in the Italian community that I know, their parents came over either after the Second World War or just before it
Mm-hmm.
because of uncomfortable things connected. Same with
Yes.
Germany, same with Britain, same with many places, right?
Yes.
The new world becomes that place of new opportunity and a fresh start. The more people dive into their history, the more uncomfortable things will come up. I think this is really what's important here, is that oftentimes what will happen is one of two things. People will shut down and not want to look at it, or people will vilify those individuals and those ancestors as being corrupt, evil. I don't want to know about them, right?
Mm.
And then that's because that's more about your discomfort than necessarily them. We were talking about, who was I talking to the other day? I was talking to another podcaster, and he shared that his family came over, or one of his ancestors came over on the Mayflower,
Oh,
and because it's
wow.
a very, I know, right? I'm not going to say his name, but he found that really cool. But what he did find was that in the family, because they were good Christian folk, the idea was that they would never enslave anybody, right? And then he discovered that one of their ancestors, very early ancestors, was a slave owner. What does he do with that? And particularly somebody with a mixed heritage himself. Well,
Wow.
how do you work with that?
Right. And
So it's
the
either one
story
of
we
two
tell
ways.
ourselves.
The story we tell ourselves, right? Now, I think in the United States and Canada to some degree, especially in the United States, though, we're finding situations now where the story that we want to tell ourselves is different from the reality, and the reality is what is creating the future, not the story that we're telling ourselves, but the story that we're telling ourselves, that uncomfortable, like in some versions, right, in some areas, and in some communities, the story is, I don't want to know about that history because it's too dark, it's too uncomfortable, for whatever thing, right?
Right.
But it's perpetuating those issues, right?
Yeah. And
You know,
it's perpetuating hurt. And, you know, just like internally in a family, if there's something that has gone on and everybody's, oh, we don't talk about, you know, Uncle Barry,
yes,
you know, we don't, because Uncle Barry is XYZ. We don't talk about Uncle Barry. Now,
we
you
don't
know,
talk
it's a
about
secret.
uncle.
Now, you know, it's scary. Now you're just allowing it to be, and you're not doing anything to stop it. Right. Where you
Exactly.
should be able to say, hey, Uncle Barry's kind of a pervert and maybe we should call him out on it. And then this will stop, you know? So
Exactly.
collectively, like as society, we're doing that same thing where we do that within our family structures as well.
Totally.
And those sort
Yeah.
of things get hidden in our ancestry, right? They
Yes,
get
very much
hidden,
so.
right? So how do we energetically, spiritually wade through that to become more comfortable with those things and understand ourselves and our practices better?
It's a complex answer because I think the answer to that depends on every single individual. I think it depends on the thing that is making us uncomfortable. I think that is also I think that it also comes down to what our relationship with the ancestors are. Are we keeping those ancestors, for example, slave owners? Now, again, don't come at me. This is just an opinion, but a lot of times I think liberal people tend to want to just ignore that history because it's too dark and they don't want to celebrate those individuals. And that's very fair. We don't want to celebrate individuals who did hurt. But in that ignoring, we're actually ignoring the repercussions of that person's life in our world.
Mm.
And we're cutting out a part of our ancestry, right, which is really a part of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so in doing so, we're compartmentalizing, and that's never going to lead anywhere. I think the journey is to be able to, I think the journey is to be able to not accept the repercussion of what that person did, right? But to understand the repercussions of what that person did. Not throw that person out of the family, but to be able to hold them accountable by then
Mm-hmm.
looking at how we are living in the context they created.
Mm-hmm.
My personal opinion is if we exile a problematic member of the community, of our ancestral community, there's that danger of then compartmentalizing, and so then not fully integrating that person back into our lives, not understanding, okay, what are some of the problematic pieces here, but also what are the light sides of that, what are some of the strengths that you live with, right? I'll
Mm-hmm.
give a very, very good example of that. So somebody who uh, somebody who grows up with the understanding that their ancestors were plantation owners, and they grew up in a context of family business, and that the skills and the way of looking at the world and the way of looking at business and opportunity and capitalism in that family business actually originated back with their ancestors who were plantation owners. Now, they would see that as a strength because there's a lot of strengths coming up when you grow up in any culture system, right? In any family system, you're going to have strengths. You're also going to have the reverse of that.
Right.
So the shame there is, well, I don't want to think about my plantation owner
Absolutely.
ancestors, right? And you're saying that while still putting your skills that you developed partly because of that history to then good work. Okay. So then it's about bringing those things together, putting everything into context and acknowledging it and be weird. That almost never happens. I live in the country, so I don't know what's going on. So it's
Okay.
about integration, but in the same way that shadow work, for example, is about integration.
Yes.
When you're able to integrate, you're able to then say without shame, And in that case, particularly, my ancestors were slave owners, and I am not a slave owner, and I don't agree with what they did. But
wow.
I am a product of that history, and therefore I am going to be walking in this life full well knowing that that history is a part of my life, but in understanding to undo that history. And somebody who's British, this really ties into my own history here.
Yeah.
When I did my own ancestral work, 5 generations ago, I have a line in my family that came from Ireland, that came over around the same time as the Irish famine. I have a line that comes from northern Scotland. I have a line that comes from Middle England. I have a line that comes from Cornwall, and I have a line that comes from Wales. Now, anyone who knows the history of Britain at that time knows that that's the Industrial Revolution that sucked in people from all the parts of the British Isles into being effectively not slaves, effectively a labor force to propel British imperialism.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was, people were, dying in mines and, child labor and, I would say, paid labor, but a penny a day is not really paid.
A penny a day, exactly, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
and all of those lines, those lines are also products of English people and the English establishment colonizing all of those various different countries in Britain. So within the colonizing, right? Within me, I'm a product of that history. If all of that stuff hadn't happened, I wouldn't exist, and a lot of people wouldn't exist. So what do? I then look at how am I decolonizing my practice? How am I bringing those pieces into my practice and honoring all of those various histories together, full well knowing that back when they were all alive in a community, they were all looking down on each other, and there was a hierarchical social structure, and it was a very negative thing, right? How am I then walking in the world with that? And that's part of that integration piece. I hope that answers that question, because it's such a big
such a big question. It's such a big conversation. It's such a big topic, and there's so many little points, and like we're almost out of time. Like there's so many little points in there that like I really want to, like, there you could have a whole nother conversation about all of them. Like the fact that you said, it's like shadow work, but it is like shadow work because in shadow work, you're taking the parts of yourself, the dark parts, the parts that that maybe you're embarrassed by or afraid of, those impulses that you're like, is that really me? Yeah. And guess what? All of your ancestors had those parts as well. So to be able to identify them in your ancestor and in your heritage and go, I'm going to live with this, I'm going to walk with it, and I'm going to choose differently. And I'm going to specifically say, well, no, I'm not this way. Or yeah, maybe there's alcoholism in my line, or maybe there's workaholism in my line. And I'm going to acknowledge that, see how it hurt someone else in that line, and actively make the choice to not do that. Then there's also the piece of understanding, we all come from crazy shit. The world has gone through crazy shit. Your line is colonizers. I don't even know what my line is. You know what I mean? I do joke around with my husband all the time though, because he's got, Scottish, British, heritage on one side of his family. And then we'll go somewhere. I'll be like, something will come up and I'll be like, see, your people did that. Your people did that. Like the Italians, we didn't do that. We were too busy drinking wine and eating pasta. We didn't do that. You did that. Your people. And we joke around about that, but those things are there and they're real, and they inform our lives, our practices. And I think my takeaway from this entire conversation, Ben, is how understanding and connecting with ancestral heritage informs our emotional health, our mental health, and our spiritual health, right?
Absolutely.
To be able to, like you said, integrate these things to create a fuller understanding of self. And that's really what it is about. And I think lots of magical work is meant to be helping us understand ourselves, how and why we do the things we do, so that we can be the better versions of ourselves. At least that's what it is for me. Literally could talk to you about this shit for a whole other hour, but we can't.
I
We
know. I know.
can't.
I've really enjoyed this.
This is so lit. I'm like jazzed. Okay, so the new book, the most recent book,
Mhm.
which is available now, Ancestral Whispers, Ancestral
Whispers.
Whispers,
Whispers. Whispers.
Whispers. Where can people find it? How can people follow you? How can they? I know you book sessions, so how can people book
Mhm.
sessions with you? Tell us everything.
Absolutely. Yes, of course. So I actually, so as a therapist, I do actually offer, I am able to take people from the States. I'm able to take people from Canada. I offer ancestral counseling too, which is if somebody is working with ancestral work and they want to really focus in on the stuff around that and the trauma that comes up out of that, I have a special kind of approach with that too. People can go to benstimpson.com. That has all of my stuff on there. I'm on Facebook. I'm on YouTube. I do have a podcast as well. That's now, by this time, it'll be our winter session. So there'll be like 50 episodes or something like that on there to enjoy after they enjoy yours, of course. And the book is available on anywhere you can find books. It's on Amazon. People in the States can order it directly from Llewellyn. I often like to say, go to your local independent bookstore too, which is wonderful. And most of them will be able to plug in and get these. I believe by this time I will have the some on my website, but that'll probably just be a link to go to Llewellyn or somewhere like that. So, yeah, reach out. Email is on my website too, and I look forward to reaching out and hearing from people too.
Excellent. Well, I'll be stalking you. I think I already started stalking you a little bit. So now we're
Oh,
besties.
maybe. I hope so. I hope so.
Well, we must have because I saw the big post where you put up all the guests that you're going to have. And I was like, oh, look at his
okay.
fancy podcast. That's amazing. I was like, he's a pro. I can't wait to talk to him. Okay. Ancestral Whispers by Ben Stimpson. Buy it wherever you buy books. Go to your support local bookstores, support your local witch shops. Just walk in and tell them you want this book and they will order it for you. Okay,
exactly.
Ben, last question.
Okay.
I ask it to everyone. You said that you've been listening and watching, so you should be prepared. If you could have me cook you one magical meal as a kitchen witch, what would it be and why?
I would want to try your family's version of porchetta.
My family's version of porchetta. I don't have that
Yes.
recipe.
You don't have that? Oh,
I don't.
Okay. I was making an assumption
porchetta
here.
recipe.
I was making an assumption.
But
All
now,
my Italian friends, and I only have a few of them, but all my Italian friends, they always say, "Oh, my nonna's favorite porchetta recipe," and like it's a big thing in Italy. There is different versions of
yes,
porchetta, but yeah.
But I don't have a porchetta.
But you don't have one.
So there we would be creating legacy because
Okay.
I would have to literally call relatives and find out if there is something
Relationship.
Well, I wouldn't call the living ones because they're not great.
I see.
I'd call
Of
on
course,
the dead
of
ones.
course. Yeah.
Right. And I'd be like, hey, what do we got? I would have to come up with that for you.
You can claim it too. What part of Italy specifically do you like ascribe your family from?
So my mother's side, my maternal side is from Naples and my paternal side is from Sicily. So we got a lot of, and again, I don't know anything about my father's side really. Very, very, very little. I don't know any like family recipes or anything like that. All of that came from my grandmother on my mom's side, and Nona's pan. So her mother's pan is the pan that I have. It's like a pizza pan. It's really amazing.
That so much.
Anyway, I'll have to come up with a porchetta recipe for you. That's just gonna have to, and it'll be in my next cookbook, and I'll be like dedicated to Ben Stimpson.
Oh, yes.
And
love it. I love it.
Ben, thank you so much for being here. This was absolutely amazing. I could talk to you all night. Thank you. I really appreciate you. This was amazing.
Thank you so much. I was looking forward to sitting down with you. This was amazing. I'm looking forward to sharing this in 2024.
Yes, in 2024, this will air in the new year. So thank you again so much for being here. Until next time, everyone, I wish you so many blessings and much, much gratitude.